So happy New Year to everybody.
And you.
So we did have a particularly light agenda, but we have a couple of extra things being added to the end, which hopefully people would have seen notifications on. Councillor Guest?
I've seen the Council Tax Setting Committee.
Yep.
And when were these published on the website? Because I understood the Council Committee couldn't have any other business because a member of the public could legitimately complain that they hadn't been informed of what was on the agenda and they might want to turn up and listen.
Okay, we will we'll come to that in a moment. We have both Nigel and Mark to go through our procedure on that. But obviously there is a requirement for us to formally acknowledge this in order to accommodate sorry, I'll let Nigel comment, but we are actually talking about changing our constitution in order to give us the power to do that.
So just to follow up on that, this was an issue that came to light over the Christmas period. We assessed various different options and came up with the option that's being presented in the pack this evening. It is a decision for council and was a decision that was going to go straight to council, but because we'd come up with the option prior to the scrutiny, we asked the chair only on Friday if we could add this to the agenda as a late report, and hence it is a late report and has gone out today. But when we do come to that agenda item, I will talk through that in detail. It is after this group due to go to Cabinet and Council, so there is still opportunities if this group wants feedback or they want something done slightly differently, but it is purely a logistical timetabling issue rather than any formal kind of decision-making concerns.
Thank you. And the other item that we'll have on the agenda is a presentation on the scrutiny revision proposals that followed the council engaging with an independent body. There will be some members of this committee that will have seen these proposals and actually voted on them at SPAY last week. For those of you who are already an expert on them, you are invited to either join the presentation or you can leave early if you wish. But for others of us, that will be true.
You want to stay again and hear
well organised, Chair.
It is organised, but I will say that one of the people who has seen it before is my lift home, so he is not allowed to leave. He will have to see it again. Okay, so with that said, I'll now formally start the meeting. I will note apologies for absence. I have received apologies from Councillors Santa Maria and Councillor Reynolds. Is there anybody else? That looks like we have everybody else, so welcome. Okay, declarations of interest. You're not required to declare that you are a council taxpayer, but has anybody else got any? No? Okay. Public participation, we have none.
Chairman, that was to the agenda. Moving back to the previous item, there's empty space here with Councillor Patterson's nameplate in it.
Yes, so Councillor Patterson had offered to be the substitute for Councillor Reynolds, but you will have seen an email from Member Support Services that they're trying to make sure that we are more disciplined than our last-minute substitutions. I believe there was some confusion as to whether he would be accepted as a substitute. So while we were expecting Councillor Patterson, it is formally apologies from Councillor Reynolds that we need to record. Sorry, Councillor Pound, did you? No, okay. Okay, not a problem. Apologies for that. Okay, we move on to consideration to any matter for call-in. There is none. Action points from the previous meeting. I'm glad to say that we currently have no outstanding actions. and hopefully we won't get any today either, which brings us on to the work programme. Now, we'll just warn people, I will circle back to this at the end, following the scrutiny proposals, just in case that prompts anybody to make requests on the work programme. But as of yet, neither myself, and I'm sure that Trudy would have told me if she's found any, but nobody has requested any additions to the work programme beyond what was published in the last minutes. So with all of that, I'll start the meeting proper on our agenda item 8, which is the commissioning and procurement standing orders review and update. I'm guessing we're going to come to Catherine to formally open it.
Yeah, thank you. Just the report sets out the proposed changes to make sure DPC is ready for the new Procurement Act, which is going live in February. But I'll pass over to Ben now, who'll give a brief overview of the report before we open for questions.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone's aware of the new Procurement Act that was due to come in October last year, but has been delayed until February the 24th this year. The reason behind this is that when we were part of the EU, all of our procurement regulations came under the EU procurement regulations, even though we had our own legislation. Since coming away from Europe, we have, as a government, been subsequently drafting new procurement legislation, and this is the new procurement legislation. There is a need for the council to review its existing governance framework and arrangements, which are currently delivered through the commissioning and procurement standing orders. As set out in the report, the changes, or the main changes that have been brought in by the Procurement Act are in relation to the technical side of the procurement activities, and to try to simplify and make our standing orders more effective and efficient. We have, as set out in the report, focused on the ambitions and requirements in our existing standing orders, and we have removed the technical aspects of this document into supplementary technical instructions, so that it simplifies the process for officers and makes it much easier to follow and comply, and then they will come to either the corporate procurement team or the housing procurement team, who have all undertaken training and are fully prepared for the Procurement Act when it comes into play. The report very clearly sets out what changes are being proposed, and also a need to align what's in our financial regulations in the Constitution. Certainly happy to take any questions that anyone may have on the procurement standing orders or the technical supplementary instructions. I shall open the floor.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Catherine. Any questions from the floor? Councillor Capozzi.
Just one, Ben. On page 12 of the report, paragraph 2.3.4, under recommendations, to agree that any future amendments to the CPSOs are subject to the following protocol, and you've got major and minor amendments, changes. Where's the definition of what's minor and what's major?
So typically, what currently is a case in point is if there's a change in value thresholds, or if there's a change that is deemed to be minor in terms of something that as officers we should be able to they don't have an impact on the outcome of the actual standing orders, then typically Mark has been authorised to make those changes. If it's something that has an impact on, which in this instance moving forward will be Catherine. If it's something major, like a policy decision, then that's classed as major, and that would need to come back through scrutiny and cabinet to be approved. typically there are threshold values that change every couple of years that are put within the standing orders. So there's a need to update those, but rather than try and block some of members' times by taking that through, which doesn't really add a great deal of value, bringing it through the committee cycle, it's easier for specific officers to have authority to make those small minor changes.
I'm just going to chip in because that very much leads into the input that I wanted to make. So while I have confidence that the proposals are taking us in the direction of compliance with the new new imposed rulings, and that effectively where the council needs to be, and they're looking for efficient decision making by putting the correct correct power in the hands of officers. Particularly for the senior leadership team, I do just want to sort of highlight that there are going to be a number, rather than call them major, let's call them sort of sensitive or contentious procurements that members will be directly interested in, which on the proposals here would be able to go through with officer authority. So what I do want to make sure is that officers and particularly the senior leadership team are reviewing some of those, and I believe there should be a subjective test to basically say, do we think that this is something that we should highlight to members? Because essentially, if we just go with what is written on major, I suspect there will be some things that members, in retrospect, would have liked to have had more input onto.
So just in response to that, the reference to minor or major is in relation to the rules and regulations that we must follow. In terms of making decisions on contract awards, there, as part of the Constitution, there's already delegated authority in place for officers up to a certain threshold to award contracts direct, insofar as it's been through a compliant procurement process and that there is funding in place. Typically, these are operational decisions. Should the nature of the contract be complex or political, then absolutely, I think SLT would make that decision that it would definitely come through this committee or any particular committee and then onto cabinet. But it just to state again, this is in relation to the rules and the procedures that officers must follow. That's the minor and the major changes. It's got nothing to do with contract awards. I'm also seeing this as in the entire process, and so you are exactly right. That's the key thing. It's to realise that there are certain things that are going to sit in this framework, but actually we might want to flag up, and generally they are going to be political. Everything that is in relation to commissioning procurement for the council must follow these rules. Must. In terms of authority, that's under the Constitution. Which again, I'm sure members of SLT, even if a contract value doesn't enable members of SLT to make that contract award, if it's deemed to be of political or sensitive nature, then I'm sure they will.
Right, I'll come back to the floor. Councillor Adeleke.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I welcome the bit about transparency, which is, I think, is on number 5. I think the requirement here now is that you have to publish your procurement decision and contract performance. You have to publish it. Now, this is a new regime. Are you prepared for the public onslaught if you have to go into this kind of level, publishing contract performance and procurement decisions? So it's something that is new, that is not at all.
It is. Absolutely, Councillor. There's a number of new notices that needs to be published. This specific notice is only applicable for councils or local authorities that spend over £100 million a year, and only on contract values that are above £2 million in total. Clearly, there are a number of local authorities that will impact on. I do not believe that we spend £100 million a year with third parties, so I don't think that one's applicable to us. Although some of the notices aren't applicable by law, central government are saying that this is good practice, and you should get into the habit of publishing notices on contractor performance. But specifically, you have to publish a minimum of 3 key performance indicators on contracts above £2 million if you spend more than £100 million a year. And yes, you must monitor and then publish performance by that contractor against those key performance indicators. It's not yet in practice. Is that likely to increase workload due to it probably will, but I think the idea is that as officers you will try to, or as you should be anyway, not just because it's new legislation, you should be managing the performance of a contractor anyway to ensure that it doesn't fall into poor performance. There are a number of reasons why something can fall into poor performance, and they can be externally influenced. But yes, it is something, and I think with this new legislation, it will be something that over time the thresholds will fall. But typically at the moment, I think the central government have aimed this at high value contracts, because obviously if it's a high value contract, the chances are that the financial implications of poor performance are significantly higher. That's not to say that a lower value contract that is underperforming doesn't have a negative impact on individuals. But yeah, as it stands, it is a watch and see. We're fortunate in that we don't spend over £100 million, but it will be interesting come or post February the 24th to see how this impacts on contracts and authorities across the country.
I can chime in on might frame that question slightly more. If I understand it correctly, the new requirements that you're talking about on the major things are to do with publishing things publicly. Do we feel that there is anything that would change and in particular lessen the amount that of the data that the council is currently publishing to members via the scrutiny?
Sorry, could you just repeat that again?
What is being published internally, i.e. what your team is publishing to this committee, I might have it wrong, but I'm kind of implying that that's not going to change, and that the regulations are saying what the council has to publish to the public.
Absolutely, it's publication into the open market.
I hope that gave some reassurance, because I think that's where your comment may have been coming from. Apologies if I'm projecting. Any further questions? In which case, are we officially accepting that one, or is it just a note?
I think as set out in the report, it is for committee to note.
To note, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Into the brave new world. Okay, thanks very much. Okay, our next agenda item, and I realise I did flip the two quick ones, is that we have our government finance update from Nigel.
So hopefully this committee remembers, although Christmas has been in between, early December we went through the draft budget proposals for 25-26 through the joint budget scrutiny process. Following that, as per usual, the draft local government finance settlement was announced by central government on the 18th of December, a day earlier than expected, which was good news, which outlined what funding the Quorum is expected to get at this point in time. And what this report is aiming to do, or hopefully achieving, is giving you an update on how that differs to the assumptions and proposals we had in our draft 25-26 budget papers, and also what the paper alludes to is what we're looking to do with those small variances. Just for the committee's knowledge, although the draft local government final settlement was announced on the 18th of December, the final settlement will not be announced until early to mid-February. We don't have a date at the moment. The 11th of February is the most popular guessed date at the moment. Unusually, there are going to be some things that we find out at the final settlement that we haven't found out yet. And one of them is national insurance funding, which, to quote the MJ today, has been dealt with by the government is an absolute shambles, is how they described it, both in terms of the funding and also in terms of the narrative that's going out to authorities. But that's a side issue. In terms of the changes that have come out from the draft settlement, is in table 1 of the report, so hopefully that kind of succinctly nets that out. We've got slightly more core funding than we expected, about £300,000, and the proposal outlined in the paper is that that will go towards supporting our under pressure temporary accommodation budget. Now, the committee will not remember this, but at Q2, the financial report was showing a pressure of 300,000 on temporary accommodation, and the Q3 report, which is due next month, is likely to show a slight increase. Now, we were hoping when we were setting the draft budgets in kind of October, November, that that was going to be a short-term pressure. But after a root and branches review of temporary accommodation, demand and supply, it's looking like that's more of a medium-term issue. So although in the initial draft budget we proposed filling that gap with reserves in the short term, it's now becoming more of a fundamental baseline pressure. Hence, we're looking to use that core funding to support that pressure on an ongoing basis. Temporary accommodation is likely to be ongoing as a pressure. The demand for temporary accommodation through the reduction in the private sector to the asylum demands and also other demands through DWP changes are creating a huge demand in that area. And as you can imagine, finding new property and new spaces is not a quick solution. So I imagine that's going to be something that we talk about over the short and medium term. That is the one major change that came out of the draft local government settlement. There are some minor ones, such as slight alteration to retain business rates of 50,000 and new homes bonus by 60,000. They were contributions to reserves, so they will just reduce those contributions to reserves. And the other area of significant growth, which again is linked to temporary accommodation, is the homelessness prevention grant. Now, we don't normally get told these figures until February, so it's good news that we've got them earlier. It's also good news that we're getting £500,000 more than what we got in 24-25. I'm reliably informed, as we're now putting together a spending plan, that the service will more than adequately spend those funds in 25-26. The service is under significant pressure, and again, that temporary accommodation growth is what comes out of that homelessness prevention growth. So from that perspective, it seems like the government are aware of temporary accommodation, they're maybe not channeling the funds in exactly the right direction. The one new aspect of funding that is expected to be one-off for 25-26 is funding to support the national insurance pressures that came about as of the last budget. Now, we were expecting at the time to hopefully receive up to £300,000, which wouldn't have funded everything, it would have funded half of what the pressure is. We're now led to believe through various different sector modelers, there's going to be between about 160 and 180,000. So probably around about a quarter of what the actual pressure is on our budgets. Now, we've been able to fund that through other funding streams and core funding, but it's not a particularly positive place to be. And the sector is overall not particularly enthralled by, one, not having specific funding amounts, but two, having no understanding of how that's been allocated. All they're saying really is a top-down approach, and that other authorities are receiving more funds. So, for instance, County Council are expecting significantly more funding than they were originally expecting. So from that perspective, it seems that there's something wrong in the government's calculations. But we've had to flex to deal with that. So other than that, no significant change at this point proposed for the final budget papers that will come back to the scrutiny next month. But I'll open up for questions.
Councillor Elliott.
Yeah, extended producer responsibility, the one-off grant, £1.4 million. That's to do with evidently manufacturers, packaging, etc. How does that affect us? Is that for us to we take basically household waste and we have to, you know, grade it in a better way, and that's our doing that sort of thing.
So just to give a bit of background on this, I am aware I've just skirted over the biggest number in the report. So the government announced about 4 years ago that they wanted to create a scheme called the Extended Producer Responsibility, just to make it really simple and easy for people to understand. It's a really complex name. And the idea of that scheme initially was that they were going to tax big manufacturers and producers, so Amazon, McDonald's, a tax, that the money would then go towards collecting those waste products that they produce and recycle them. That was the original idea, and over the last few years it's been chipped and shaped by different government departments, and along the way changed significantly because business pushed back on another tax on business, even though it's only going to be for the very large suppliers of materials. So you're really your top end kind of businesses, not your local cafe or restaurant. It was going to be your McDonald's, your Amazons, etc. One of the big issues for local authorities was, one, it meant that we were going to have to significantly change how we collected recyclable materials, because they were setting out lots of different scope and skills of what you collected and how you collected it. But equally, they wanted us to collect information on what we were collecting as well from certain producers. And there was a big concern from local authorities that these big companies would find a way of not paying this tax or not paying it, and so we'd be left with a burden of cost of collecting, but no income. What has happened is the government have said they want to plough ahead with this scheme, and what the scheme will do is looking at collecting different materials in different ways and making sure that recycling increases. So one of the things we have found out in the last couple of weeks is that they are looking for local authorities to collect paper and cardboard separate to other materials. And that's one of the burdens that potentially we will face in 25-26. And the government are giving all local authorities a one-off payment in 25-26 to fund this new burden. But these new burdens are still not entirely known. They're coming out slowly over time and will probably grow throughout the year. The reason it's one-off is because the government still aims for those large manufacturers to be funding this going forward, but they haven't created a scheme that's effective enough or realistic enough to be able to deliver that. So they're funding it for 1 year. There is a pressure for us because, one, we don't fully know what we'll have to do in 25-26 to meet the terms of the new burdens. And two, the likelihood is they will carry on after 25-26 and we have no guaranteed funding, which is the two reasons why the proposal is to put this in a reserve to fund whatever new burdens we have to do in 25-26. So if we have to do a new route to pick up paper and cardboard separately, that will cost us a significant amount of money, and these funds will be drawn down to fund that. And then equally, we'll probably have to do that in 26-27, when at the moment, we don't know how it will be funded. That's the second reason why this is put in reserves, because potentially will be needed in the medium term as ongoing support.
Now, the $64 million question is £1.4 million. Evidently, that's been well thought through, calculated, and what we do, and you're going to go, no, it hasn't. We don't have a clue how the company.
It hasn't. It's been calculated based on population size and levels of recycling, but very little else in terms of detail. Bearing in mind, they might ask us to do different new burdens throughout the year, which will impact different authorities in a different way. That's probably why they're being quite broad brush in their assessment, because they don't know what the pressures will be. The one thing I would say is when they bring the new burdens in, what we can do is we can do an assessment of our existing service to see if it meets the criteria, but we're constantly getting government support, and a report has literally dropped to my inbox in the last few hours around some new burdens that we might need to do with this. So what I will say is that is in a reserve, which is managed by members. So if we are going to draw it down, a report will go back to Scrutiny and Cabinet to say this is what we need it for, this is why, and this is how much will be drawn down.
Thanks, Nigel. Councillor Guest.
Thank you, Chairman. This growth in the general fund budget, £300,000, is being allocated to temporary accommodation. The pressures in the temporary accommodation budget and the potential pressures going forward have been highlighted. Are there any other areas of council spend which would have benefited from some of this 300,000?
In terms of largest pressure, the temporary accommodation is our largest ongoing pressure. There are other areas of the council that are under pressure at the moment. The waste service has been reporting a pressure this year in terms of delivery. They've got several mitigation strategies in place to try and bring that back to base. There are some other areas of the council that, again, are under financial pressure, but we're hoping that mitigation and investment and some of the transformation work are going to bring those back to budget. But again, we are bringing the Q3 report back to this committee next month, so you get a chance to look at all the variances across the council. In terms of the budget for 25-26, I believe all the major variations that are not mitigated or planned for at the moment are now fully funded for next year. It doesn't mean we won't have variances. There'll be some services that overspend and some that underspend. There will be some risks and opportunities. But at this moment in time, I feel like the major pressures are financed in the way that they should be.
Councillor Deacon.
I've got no issues with the £300,000 being allocated for temporary accommodation. It's just I'm on a process of learning. Well, you mentioned for asylum seekers. Am I wrong in thinking that's a county council responsibility to fund that, or is it split?
So homelessness is a district responsibility at the moment.
Okay.
So we are responsible for recording, assessing our homelessness and providing them with support or homes or opportunities. And it is a general fund pressure as well. Some people often get confused with HRA. It's a general fund core service that we need to deliver.
You mentioned asylum seekers. Is that our responsibility?
So asylum seekers,
county level?
asylum seekers fall under that to a certain extent. There is a lot of different schemes at the moment for different groups of asylum seekers where we work in conjunction with Hearts or with other districts or even with DWP directly, because there is lots of different mechanisms in place for that.
Thank you.
But the homelessness of the asylum is a responsibility.
Thanks. Councillor Adeleke.
Thank you. Nigel, you at the beginning of your presentation, you said the settlement is better than expected.
Yeah.
So are you feeling like you've won the lottery or something?
He's not a politician. I'll let him answer the question. But
I suppose, from my perspective, I am happy that we've got a balanced proposed budget for 25-26, which mitigates most of our significant pressures. I still think we are underfunded for the pressures that we have, and I think national insurance is one element of that underfunding. So I am content that it wasn't worse than it was. What I would say is, and I've sketched over a lot of the minutiae of detail, the draft settlement had the largest changes in funding that I've seen at a draft settlement in terms of out of the blue. So, we talked in this group last year minimum funding guarantee. That's just disappeared overnight and replaced with what they call a funding floor. Last year, we were guaranteed at least a 4% increase in funding year on year. Draft settlement this year, 0%. It was only because of, I will say this, good modelling and a little bit of sector kind of understanding that the government was going to have to squeeze things that we're coming in a reasonable position. I can tell you now there are Hertfordshire districts out there that are not one bit happy about the settlement and are having to make some significant changes to their proposals for next year. In recent years, we've potentially been accused of being too prudent at draft budget stage. This year, I think we got it about as close as we could have done. So from that perspective, I'm content, but I'm happier when maybe it proves we're a little bit more prudent than we were this year.
Please, Chair, can I now ask my question?
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Nigel. Now, 242 on the homelessness prevention. You've got 1.5 million, which you are putting in reserve. Given all the presentation that we've had over the years on homelessness prevention, I think it's something that we as a borough, we are actually leading the way in what we are doing. Is there any reason why we cannot go straight into action? If not, how long is this spending plan going to take before it's completed?
So just for clarity, we're getting 1.44 million. We're proposing to put 509,000 of it into reserves. Because at the moment, we already have a spend in year budget, baseline budget of 929,000. So it's the additional amount we're proposing to put into reserves whilst we develop how that money can be best invested to help the homelessness prevention service. It is a grant with conditions, so we have to allocate it in line with the grant conditions. But more importantly, we want to achieve the best outcomes in that service area that we can. So from that perspective, it takes some time. The service have actually, unusually in a positive place, because normally we receive the homelessness prevention grant in about February. So to receive it just before Christmas has given the service a lot more time to start the planning on what they will look to allocate that from. And I would expect that by year end and definitely the first quarter report, we'll be coming back with an understanding of how that money is going to get spent in 25, 26 to meet the conditions and to provide good outcomes for the homelessness.
That's almost identical to the question I was going to ask. Sorry, I know there's two people waiting, but I'm just going to chip in. Can you just confirm on that answer if any capital expenditure could possibly be, ignoring the values, but would if we identified capital capital purchases to be able to help in building that infrastructure, would that be on the cards? We can always use revenue to fund capital. It would not be the preferred option. We would generally use capital receipts. We would use borrowing before grants, other grants or borrowing before we would use revenue spend. If there was a capital solution, then we would look at that and probably pull it into the whole capital programme rather than use a specific revenue grant. Also, again, we'd have to look at what the terms and conditions are when they come out for the homelessness prevention grant to make sure that if we were going to spend it on capital, it would be in line with those key issues. So it would be an option, but it probably wouldn't be a favoured option. Okay. Right, sorry about that. Councillor Capozzi.
Thank you. On table 1 and the last column, is this end of the sentence missing? I gave the domestic abuse safe accommodation grant. So it says a new grant to be utilised in line with the grant conditions once the service.
Yes, there has been. It was the service have created the spending plan. It is a new grant that's coming in 25-26.
And my follow-up question would be, what exactly can you do with £35,000? 37,000, sorry. Well,
I don't know is the answer at this moment in time. But what I always say when you get grants like this is sometimes that can pump prime something bigger. You can put a small amount of council funds towards something that might actually deliver something bigger than what 37,000 looks like. At the end of the day, we could do more with £37,000 than we can do with nothing. But probably not a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks. Councillor Deacon.
Just quickly, you mentioned that you were pleased with the what you received. Is that money in the bank? Is that money received, or with the rumblings of what's going on at the moment, the pound tumbling and cost of borrowing going up, could there be a budget in 4 months' time to change this? Or
so as I said at the beginning, this is a draft settlement. So the final settlement, which will go through Parliament, hopefully within the first couple of weeks of February, will give us our final amount, and they'll be set for 25-26. It would be, or it is entirely unheard of to change an in-year budget. And given that the government are now proposing to do a fair funding review to release figures for medium-term funding for 26 onwards, and that's going to be hopefully June time, I suspect that these will be pretty much written in stone. The wider economic impacts do factor on us, though. We do have some borrowing, and if borrowing is going to continue to go up, that will have an impact. But equally, we have investment in treasury returns, and if interest rates are going to stay higher for longer, as we have done in the last couple of years, we may get greater returns on our treasury investments. So, and that's something we're monitoring very closely, and we're looking at as part of our treasury strategy, which is delivered as part of the budget.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Stevens.
I'm disappointed to find that we've got the new home burners reduced significantly. Is the government likely to increase the grant funding for building homes to try and compensate for something like this?
So the new homes bonus was due to end 3 years ago, and every year they've extended it by 1 year. The reason it is lower, significantly lower this year, is because we have built less homes and above the threshold that they start to finance additional homes. And hence, as we're reporting in December Cabinet, our council tax base, the growth of number of houses is slowing down. That is not decorum, that's a sector issue because of the viability of schemes at the moment. Is the government going to do a new scheme? The expectation as part of the fair funding review is that the new homes bonus funding that government has still allocated in its overall funding pot will go to a new housing development scheme. Where those funds go, private sector, public sector, what they support is very much an unknown entity at the moment. We've been waiting for this scheme for a couple of years, previous government, present government. We hope the fair funding review in the spring will bring some certainty in the medium term.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? No. Okay, well, I'm glad we can close that item. Thank you for the update. That brings us on to the star of tonight's performance, which is the Council Tax Setting Committee, and we will come straight back to Nigel with a remark.
So once again, apologies that this is a late report. It was fairly last minute decision to bring this to scrutiny. We wanted to be as open and transparent as we wanted. But what I would say is the headline is this is purely a logistical timing issue. This is not a significant issue or concern. And the one question that I expect from everybody is Decorum will absolutely be setting its council tax at the full council meeting on the 14th of February, if I remember my dates. Absolutely, that's what we set. We set a council tax requirement. We've already set a council tax base. What this council tax group will do, will sign one document that normally goes to council every year called the Council Tax Declaration, after Herts County Council have formally agreed their precept, because we can't, through legislation, agree that council tax declaration until all precepting partners have formally agreed what their part of the council tax is. So this is purely a technical aspect, signing a form that is 3 pages long and is very technical in nature to outline exactly what the council tax bill is and how it's broken down. It is not to remove any powers from council for setting the Decorum council tax. That's the main message to get across. Why has this happened? It's happened for 2 reasons. One, because County have moved their budget setting to right at the end of February to avoid half term at member requests. And 2, because I only found out about it in December. And so hence that's why this has come quite late. I'm not the only one. We're not the only authority that have found out about this quite late. And other authorities, which is where this idea came from, already have this in their constitution. It feels like something sensible to put in place in case this happens again in the short or medium term, and allows us to prevent having to have a full extraordinary council on the 25th or 26th of February with all members brought in for what would probably be a 2-minute meeting. So it seems like an appropriate approach to take to have a small subset of the committee to agree what the overall council tax base is.
I realise I'm being pedantic. Just in case anybody was wondering, you don't have a full council meeting on Friday, the 14th of February. You should have a Valentine's Day with somebody else other than Nigel. No offence. The council meeting is Wednesday, the 19th. So
Still half term.
okay. Could you just sum up if we did not make this change, we have the option of an extraordinary general council meeting. Do we have any other options?
Not that we can see at this point in time. The 2 options were to move council to the 25th or 26th, which couldn't be done because council also set our housing revenue account rent levels, and we want to make sure we get the bills out on time prior to the 1st of March. So we couldn't do that. So the other option was an extraordinary meeting or a subset of the committee.
Okay. And then my other question, again, I'm just asking these questions to be thorough and to tick them off. I'm not honestly thinking that there is a possibility. So we are responsible for collecting the council tax that is set by a number of our Is there any prospect at all that when Herts come along and say, we want you to collect this much, that we could ever turn around and say, no, we don't agree?
Yes, if they are breaching council tax legislation. So if they came to us on the 25th and said, we want to increase council tax by 10%, and we do not have authority by the Secretary of State, as the billing authority, we would say, no, you have to go away and set it within the parameters of the council tax legislation. That is the only point that we could say no.
Okay. So in effect, what we would be doing by ceding the decision-making power on DBC to the subcommittee is this subcommittee is confirming that neither Herts or PCC, but I'm guessing their budget's going to be done before council, is compliant with what they are entitled to do before triggering off a referendum.
Yeah, and there will be a draft council tax declaration that will be attached to the council on the day, because on that day is when Herts County Council actually publish it. So we will have a document that won't change for a week, but we have to set up a formal meeting to approve it.
Yeah, and obviously because Herts have to formally do that. Okay, hopefully we've flushed out everything. Councillor Silwell.
There is a legal implications. Saying it's a political balance rules, but I can't see labor involved. Can you explain a little bit?
Because this is proposed as a 5-member committee, Labour actually have, when we work it through, and it's the same for any other 5-member committees, I think it comes as 0.49, which is just below the threshold to give you 1 member on the committee. So that goes to the independents, and that's consistent with other 5-person committees. So.
All right, thank
you. Having commented what the power of the committee would be, I guess I can see the concern, but I would just suggest that all members, no matter what party, will have direct contact with the officers to comment what the officers are asking the committee to do. So in effect, you will be able to feed into the officers if you felt that the committee was going to make a decision or an approval that you weren't happy with.
I just asked question. It's a political balance, it's rules, so that's fine. Thanks.
The 5-member committee, I'm guessing, has been proposed as being the standard size, but we could have a different size committee if other groups wanted to keep that. Just obviously it would, no offence, inconvenience more people because they would have to attend and sign that. So I welcome people to suggest other formats of the committee if we don't want to go with Mark's recommendation. Councillor Williams.
Just a couple of points. Firstly, in the bit where it refers to consultation, I'm not aware that any members of my group were consulted.
In terms of this is starting part of the consultation process.
Oh, right, okay.
And members are then open to feedback on this concept and idea prior to it going to Cabinet and then Council. It is a full vote by Council, so all councillors will have a chance to vote on whether this subcommittee is set up or not.
Yeah, okay. Well, when you implied it's in the past tense, so I assumed that. I don't have a problem with it being set up. Following on from what the chair said, he doesn't have any powers to have any discretionary powers to make any changes. Everything it does will already be predetermined by higher authority. All he can do is effectively signing off and bringing together up to 4 precepts, which have already been decided by the 4 preceptors. So it will have no discretion to make any decisions other than that which is already handed to it. So it doesn't really have any power to do anything apart from just formally sign it off. It also noted in the report that it will set the council, it will meet again in December to set the council tax base, which traditionally has been a role of Cabinet, and I think should remain a role of Cabinet, and this committee should only meet in these extraordinary circumstances. So if the same situation didn't occur in 2026, then there'd be no need for this committee to meet again.
So the reason that was added in there is because the nature of the council tax setting report, as a lot of the members will know, particularly Cabinet members, is it ends up being published on the day of Cabinet, depending on when Cabinet is, because you have to do the council tax base report based on the council tax base as of the 1st of December, which means it ends up being a very late report. So the only reason we added it in here is if for whatever reason we were unable to get it into a Cabinet meeting. It's a fallback plan, which is part of the reason why a lot of the authorities have this, a fallback plan in case of timetables. We don't propose moving that from being a Cabinet decision unless logistics mean that another group could sign it off. But I am not wedded to that. I can quite happily take that out in terms of the functions if that's a proposal that people would prefer.
Certainly think you would need to reword 2.4 on page 4, because the implication of that is that it will meet twice a year and it will set the council tax base.
Yes, again, this is a paper for scrutiny. We can change that and we can change the functions of the 1.5 and remove the council tax base. I'm comfortable to do that. I think it does provide another option but if that's what members want, then we can go with that.
I'll be more comfortable with that.
So if I'm understanding that suggestion correctly, it's basically that on each exercise, you need a proactive decision from Cabinet to say that the power is ceded to this subcommittee.
So all we need to do is change the recommendation. So we'll get rid of set the council tax base in accordance with local authority. We'll just do setting the council tax declaration. So we'll move it from 1.5, 2.1, and the group will only meet once a year to agree the council tax declaration. That's what we're saying. So I will reword that report for Cabinet off the back of committee comments.
Okay. Right. Any further comments, Councillor Allen?
So it'll be once a year if needed.
Yes, if needed. Again, for me, ideally, we added it with the declaration goes with the council. There is a fallback plan.
I hear what Councillor Williams is saying, but having the option of being able to have a fallback in December as an if needed requirement. But again, if Cabinet can make the decision, this isn't needed. So it's really an if needed situation.
Setting the council tax base is something that most councils actually delegate down to officers because it is something that can be delegated. Just because of the nature of the timing of it. I'm happy to take the lead from the committee, what the committee want.
I would suggest that whatever wording we've got now, we're basically implying that that if Cabinet/Council does not have scope to do things because of timing, that this is the default fallback, and that we don't have the option to propose something else whilst this is in our constitution. But we're changing it so that it doesn't become a requirement. It's only there is the fallback. I think that's been well presented and well answered. Do we have any further comments? Okay, so I believe that what will happen is that subject to the changes that we've requested, the proposal for amendments to our constitution will then go to Cabinet to then come through at council.
Yeah, and there'll be a full vote at council on the final report.
Okay.
So, Chair, we're not going to sort of just go around the room to see if those changes are going to be put in or taken out. Sorry, so changes today. Just because, like Councillor Stevens said, if in the future it should occur, we'd have to go back and change the constitution again to include it. Whereas if it's there and it's needed, it's just there. It's almost like silent. It doesn't matter if it.
Yeah,
if it's never needed, it's never needed.
Correct. So those are the changes that Nigel's going to do. So we can't. There isn't a point. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. There isn't a point on us having a vote on it now because the wording that's in there at the moment needs to be changed. But I think that we're all agreed on what that wording is going to cover. So therefore, we're going to be content for the modified version to go through to Cabinet, so then it can proceed on to Council. So because we don't have a final draft of things, it's at this point the instruction that's going through with the report.
So can I propose, Chair, that I will make the adjustments and then circulate to the group leaders for feedback prior to the final report being published for Cabinet, so we've got a consistent report that members are happy with for Cabinet and then to Council.
I'm happy with that. Does any other councillor have any concerns on that treatment?
We can send it to independent members as well, obviously, to make sure you're content.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for that. That concludes that item, which brings us to a final, final item for the evening, which is the scrutiny proposals. So as mentioned before, if you want to run, you may run.
So that is the we'll do our best. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Committee. I would just like to introduce Ian Parry, who's on the call from the Centre for Governance and Scrutiny, who carried out this review. It was actually carried out initially by a lady called Kath Buckley. She's left subsequently to go to the LGA. So Ian is helpfully stepping in to present the review and the outcomes from it. So the last review of scrutiny was carried out in 2019, and it's good practice to periodically review scrutiny. As we know, scrutiny has a vital function, which is a number of different aspects to it. But its overall function is to hold the executive to account, as we know. And we see this as really a key opportunity to ensure that scrutiny continues to make a real difference to the council. I am going to hand over here Ian, who's just going to give an overview of the findings of the review. It's going to be very much a double act between the two of us. Once we get through this initial presentation, we'll look at the individual recommendations and then the actions that I've taken away and developed on the back of those recommendations for scrutiny to consider. So Ian, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Good evening, everyone. So the review actually has various components to it. The first bit is gathering the insights, understanding how you work in terms of your scrutiny model, your scrutiny operation. So we draw on a number of things. We conducted a survey with members and officers. We got a decent response rate, we think. That's typical, 25%, 68% of officers, always slightly larger for some reason. But a representative sample, I think, in terms of the survey. We then conducted 11 one-to-one interviews with elected members and officers, 6 officers interviewed, as well as 11 members, and a number of focus groups, including sort of political groups, etc., in order to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to contribute. And besides that, of course, we then do our desktop research, looking at what you're looking at, which is agendas, minutes, and available recordings or observations of your meetings. It's about watching, observing, reading, and talking to you to gather that insight. So key findings then, and some interesting strengths. You know, you have really good officer support. We noted. That's recognised and valued by members. Certainly members are engaged in meetings, and there's a good level of questioning skills. Frankly, I've just observed that in your meeting this evening, which was interesting to listen to and to watch. So a good level of engagement and interest by members, that's crucial. A willingness to also to embrace change and think about how you can do things better and differently. There's always room for sort of greater creativity, greater thinking, greater innovation. So members are very much up for improving and change. Both officers and members therefore desire to learn from good practice elsewhere. There is always good practice from other places. It's not easy to transplant it, but it's certainly to observe it is a good thing. And a firm commitment from members to link what they're doing with the issues that really affect local people, which is crucial to scrutiny. Linking things that you're doing to what the residents of the borough require as well. So, key areas of focus. We were looking at 4 key areas of focus, and they were the structure. Do you have the right structure in place? Do you have the right level? Do you have the right model of scrutiny committees? What they're looking at, etc. So is the kind of infrastructure of scrutiny right? Secondly, culture. Is the relationships, the understanding, the working togetherness within the council well? Is there a good level of dedicated scrutiny resource? And we noted that there wasn't necessarily dedicated scrutiny resource, but certainly a level of expertise within the council that was well regarded and well respected by members. But in terms of culture, we didn't see anything outside what's generally considered normal in local government in terms of political competitive debate. that would concern us. So those areas we looked at. Working practices in terms of how your agendas are put together. Are members involved in that? Do you have control of that? Work programs, that sort of thing. We noted perhaps a lack of in-depth scrutiny with more of an external focus, perhaps too much internal focus, and a need to look at things which have a much more of a community aspect to them, for members to look at those sort of things. And topic selection in terms of agendas or things which lead into agendas, work programs, etc., perhaps could be better led by members, could have a greater involvement of members and not so fed to members, but actually members constructing what they feel they want to look at. And in terms of impact, whilst there is some impact, clearly, and we're not disputing that, there is a lack in this, that there is perhaps poor feedback loops from the recommendations that Scrutiny makes to Cabinet, and those feedbacks back to Scrutiny, to ensure that there is a continuous loop of improvement between Scrutiny recommendations and Cabinet understanding of those recommendations, and perhaps either acting upon them or giving some feedback back to Scrutiny to see how those can improve. So in terms of recommendations then, we move from understanding how you're working, assessing how we feel that's operating, and then trying to provide you with some solutions, some ideas on how you can improve on that. So in terms of structure then, there's an issue really predominantly around capacity, that you've got quite a bit of capacity, but we feel you could get more out of it. You know, there are perhaps more meetings in many respects than you might need. And there's often a feeling that you can actually get more by doing less in many respects. If the focus is tighter, it doesn't mean that Scrutiny is not as involved. It means that potentially Scrutiny is more involved, but is more strategic and more thematic and more engaged by decluttering its agendas, taking out the things which are kind of for information and those sort of things, and making sure its meetings are well and truly laser focused and productive. So we think there's opportunities just to consider some of those things. I'm going to hand back to Mark for some of the actions out of that.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so one of the key areas we looked at is the number of meetings. So we are planning to reduce the number of overview and scrutiny meetings to 5 meetings plus 1 budget each year, from the current 7 plus an optional second budget in the February time. And the plan, as Ian mentioned, is really to look at what comes to committee, so to give greater focus on thematic ideas rather than so much focus on overall in-depth performance updates. So this might be looking at things like delivery against corporate plan objectives, growing areas of customer demand, issues that you see from the public in terms of council service provision. We have noticed that members still like to see performance data before them, so we are still planning to have 2 meetings a year, which will have a performance focus across the council. But generally what we want to do is take performance reporting onto what we're going to develop, a newly developed members portal. And we want to enable that so that members can ask questions through that portal and get direct answers from officers as well. On the back of this as well, we want to realign Cabinet. So we'll have this continual cycle of 5 meetings per year, 5 scrutiny, 5 Cabinet, then on to 5 council meetings. What we are planning to add in as well is an additional 5 contingency Cabinet meetings, just in case there's not enough capacity in those main meetings to get all the business done. Audits as well, just to ensure we stick to this cycle of 5, will be reduced to 5 from the current 6. Yeah.
So the second part of the structure recommendations was we thought perhaps you could get more out of scrutiny by a greater integration across the committees, and therefore developing this sort of linear approach by better communication between scrutiny chairs, and arranging that so that you can share, for example, work programs and making sure that they are aligned, avoid duplication, and make sure that all the bases are covered through that kind of horizontal approach between regular meetings of scrutiny chairs. Back to you, Mark.
So what we're really keen is to ensure that we're getting chairs fully involved in developing work plans, which will still be approved by committee. But what we're planning to do is have one initial work planning meeting in sort of February, March time to plan through the year. And then there will still be quarterly reviews so that committee gets a chance to add new items to agendas throughout the year. And each work plan will still come to committee for approval as it does at the moment. You'll see it, you'll be able to add items in, and it will be flexible in that way. The work plans will also be shared electronically on the members' portal, so all members can have a look across the three scrutiny committees. Because one of the main feedbacks was that there wasn't necessarily a joined up approach to scrutiny, because chairs didn't necessarily have sight of each other's work plans. So we want to build in to ensure that that ability is there.
So the next phase is about the recommendations we produced on relationships and culture. And importantly, it's vital that scrutiny does not operate in isolation, that it is total counsel. So therefore, we suggest that there's an awareness raising development program for both members and officers together to understand how to get the best out of scrutiny, and a range of development and learning programs for both officers and members to actually align again in terms of thinking and understanding and impact that scrutiny can have. We often see and observe that there is a kind of a gap between what members want and what officers think they need, and therefore bringing that together so that both understand each other and both understand what's needed and what the objectives of scrutiny are, well, it will produce better outcomes. So there's some recommendations in terms of the actions there.
Yeah, so we'll still have the induction programme for all members and the training in scrutiny when members start their term. But in addition to that, what we want to do is bring in some bite-sized training opportunities. So these might be short briefing sessions before the committee, or they might be training sessions which we put on the members' portal so that members can just check in and watch a video to get themselves briefed and up to date on relevant areas. We are conscious that members come in for a lot of meetings, they have a lot of training sessions at the start of their term, so we're just trying to provide a more flexible approach so members can make sure they get the training that you need. So we want to look at all different opportunities for training, so this might be on scrutiny governance, on the processes that you'll follow through scrutiny, or service-specific briefings that might come before you for scrutiny.
So the next recommendation under relationships and culture is about developing work plans, work programs. This is really crucial to scrutiny. What scrutiny decides to look at is clearly going to drive the outcomes at the end of the day. Are you looking at the right things? Is what you're looking at aligned to the mission critical things of the council, the things which are important to residents, etc. So the idea here is to ensure that the program or the plan for work programming is constructed in a useful way that brings in all those kinds of sources of information that will inform what you need to look at in terms of your work programs and eventually your agendas. But having a clear methodology behind that it isn't a kind of random exchange of information and ideas, but there is a structure to it. Perhaps even the methodology has a kind of scoring or gateway or any other of those kinds of rationales that you can apply to ensure that you are looking at the right things and that there is a justification for what you are looking at, and potentially just as importantly, what you're not looking at, what you can afford to leave out because you feel these other things are more important. That prioritization process is part of the program, the plan of developing good work programs. So some work to be done there, we feel. And back to you, Mark, for I think some actions that are going to come out of that.
Yeah, so we want to have an annual call for work plan ideas in January, February of each year. And that'll be with councillors across the board. But also we want to go out to the public to see what areas that they feel that they may like to see scrutinised throughout the year. And then there'll be an annual work planning workshop with scrutiny chairs and vice chairs to work through. We anticipate a number of different ideas, but to prioritise the ideas that we see. So we won't be discounting anything, but we appreciate that the committee has limited time throughout the year. So we'll really be focusing on and trying to focus on the areas that can have the most impact. And we have developed a prioritisation tool, which was actually attached with the agenda papers, that we'll work through with chairs and vice chairs to make sure we get those work plans proportionate for the year. And then we'll bring that back to members so you can see what the plan is, and then add any other ideas as we go throughout the year.
So the next recommendation is pretty straightforward, really, and that is to ensure that because members can't have everything, in a sense, in the meeting or in reports, that at the moment seems to overload members in many respects in terms of too much information, too much detail. So meetings themselves need to have the essential reports, essential information to allow the scrutiny committee to function in that context. But also the information that you need outside of that, the wider information, can be shared through a digest. So the recommendation is to create a digest for all elected members to be able to access information in a reasonably convenient way, and to allow members also to perhaps ask questions or gather more information if they require it.
Yeah, so we mentioned the members portal, but this is the main method in which we intend to do that. And there can be performance reports that we'll be adding on a quarterly basis in a different format to what you've seen. So it won't list out necessarily all the service detail, but it will focus on those key corporate KPIs which are relevant for the service. And once you look at those, that may make you think that there's poor performance in a particular area, and that could be used to generate ideas for future work plans that you might want to have a deep dive into in the future. We'll use it for service briefings. There may be video recorded from service leads, or there might be short written briefings in changes in any service areas, so you can keep up to speed throughout your term. We may add some short training videos as well that members can just look at in sort of bite-sized chunks in their own time, again to keep them up to date. And as I mentioned earlier, the question and answer forum we want to bring into play, so members know where to go if they've got any ward questions or any questions relating to any data that they see through the scrutiny committees. And you'll get that answer back through officers through that forum.
So always a challenging subject for scrutiny, and that is, what level of content and detail do you need for reports for scrutiny to function effectively? And I've yet to come across a scrutiny committee that's actually 100% satisfied. There's always room for improvement here. There's always room for getting this right, and for that sort of gap to be filled. So the recommendation is really to review the content and detail for scrutiny reports and briefings. This would ensure that the consistency of communication and reporting formats, as well as helping to ensure that the purpose for an item for consideration by scrutiny and its expectations of the level of detail contained within the agenda packs is right. This therefore could be done alongside elected members and officers, so that all parties are clear on the expectations and content. In other words, for officers and members to be able to come together and share what does scrutiny want to achieve, and members and officers therefore being able in a better position to try and put together the information that they require. It doesn't always have to be a 14-page report. It can be a single-page report. It can be other things. but you can't get to that position until both sides, in a sense, understand what the objective is. Back to you, Mark.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is a simple one, really. We want to review the current format of reports for some of these deep dive areas that we'll be looking into. A much more inclusive template, so one that's not so long, and we'll be working with Scrutiny chairs to get that right. We don't want to be sending you 20-page reports and expect you to read it and digest all that information, but we do want to make sure that you're getting enough detail to enable you to do effective scrutiny. So we'll work with you on that.
So the final recommendation, therefore, is impact. How can scrutiny have more impact? And the impact is made really through scrutiny's product, which is recommendations. And the more compelling those recommendations are, the greater the impact that scrutiny is likely to have. But that can't be achieved if Cabinet isn't listening and reading and feeding back. So the idea here is how can the recommendations made by scrutiny be measured in terms of impact and feedback from Cabinet? Can there be, as I said earlier, this loop between scrutiny and Cabinet? So when you make those recommendations, Cabinet gives you feedback to say, you know, of the 3 recommendations, 2 were really good and we'll consider them, and 1 perhaps not, and this is the reason why not. There should be some feedback made to scrutiny on the recommendations you have. Otherwise, in a sense, there's very little value that scrutiny is having, and there's very little purpose to scrutiny if you're not having that kind of quality, value-adding impact to the work of the council. Back to you, Mark.
Yeah, so again, quite a simple action really here, but we're going to look at committee agendas to have a standing item which will enable feedback to be reported and how the recommendations of committee have been taken forward and how they've made a difference. And we'll report on that at each committee. The review also noted that there was very little public participation in committees. So we'll be looking across the 3 committees to see what the opportunities are to bring in public with certain interests in the area or service-specific experts who might be able to add to the debate and add some feedback. So we want to try and develop a little bit more of an interactive approach. So thank you very much for listening to that. We just wanted to give you a bit of an overview of the key recommendations, but we're happy to open up to any questions anybody's got.
Councillor Guest.
Thank you, Chairman. There are 2 questions here. The first one is, it's welcome that there are going to be, as recommended, there'll be 5 contingency cabinet meetings to deal with any urgent business that crops up. I couldn't see any reference to contingency scrutiny meetings, so is it intended that we'll be having those? That's the first question.
Okay, it's not at the moment. We do feel, because most of the key information and decisions that come to Cabinet have quite a long lead-in time, that we feel you've still got a scrutiny meeting every other month, that we do feel that that's sufficient when ultimately it goes through to Cabinet for those decisions. So we believe it's enough. We always have that ability to call an urgent meeting if we really needed to, but we feel throughout the year 5 should still be sufficient.
I see that to prevent recommendations being lost in the ether, then it's going to be part of each cabinet, each scrutiny committee meeting agenda, then the follow of recommendations. That's one way of doing it. The county council has a separate impact of scrutiny advisory committee, ISAC, which ensures that recommendations don't get lost in the ether. Has that been considered as a way of making sure that recommendations are followed up?
It hasn't. I appreciate there are different approaches, but we feel sticking to the 5 main committees with that feedback loop is more appropriate. You should have the same members then who are getting feedback as to how their direct recommendations were taken forward, we feel if you bring another group of members in, that could get slightly lost, and members from that committee won't necessarily see how their recommendations have been taken forward. So you can do it different ways. We're trying to keep meetings as condensed as possible. We're conscious that members have a lot of meetings. So if we can get the business done in the way we proposed, then we think that would be sufficient.
Related question / suggestion from me. Obviously, there is some there are some good proposals, and we like things that are being considered, but obviously some concern on concertinaing items to try to squeeze more stuff into the reduced number of meetings. Can I suggest that alongside these proposals, we also look at some of the officer presentations that are currently being delivered that generally come through very similar to a scrutiny. So we've had a housing allocations policy meeting, we've had a homelessness and associated domestic services presentation where all members are able to go there. We effectively get a deep dive into that service, and we get to, all members get to make sort of questions and comments on that sometimes works like a scrutiny side, but obviously it may not be as topical or related specifically to the time. If we've got some of those things going at the same time, and there is almost a formal programme that goes alongside that, I think that would make some of our questions more useful in those formats while having scrutiny more on the public and formal side.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly the opportunity, and we do use that for more detailed service briefings at times. There's also task and finish groups that we can use as well for more deep dive. So if a committee sees an area, but they feel it needs more detailed understanding, we can always set up smaller groups, as we do for things like the local plan, etc. at the moment. But we don't use task and finish groups that much, but I think there's an opportunity there to use a different formats, yeah. Okay, and I'll obviously have lots of more detailed comments in regards to the members portal, but one of the things that, and I know that I'm very different to a lot of other members on this, so I would like to see that while I'd like reports to be sort of summarised that people can digest easily, on a portal, I would love to see all of the detailed information that is compiling up to that. So effectively, when I see something on a report, I can drill into it. I can try to work out what the basis of a recommendation is, and therefore I can make detailed questions if I want. So there's always that balance between the report that is usable for people to have an informed meeting, but also has enough information so that I'm basically not simply reliant on an officer to tell me what I should be focused on. And the great news with the portal is that allows people like me to drill in. And you could also be looking at the information could be on the report a long time before, on the portal a long time before the report is, because I think one of the issues we've got at the moment is we kind of publish everything for the 10-day window. So effectively, it doesn't matter if lots of the information was ready 3 weeks beforehand, we kind of don't see any of it until it's published, rather than you could be putting things out on a piecemeal basis and then kind of get a final agenda. The portal will have that ability to do that, and we can look at the level of detail that members are seeing, and there's always that opportunity to go back to officers and ask for more detail as well. It's not adequate, so we can certainly look at that. This will be continually reviewed and developed. You know, these ideas we want to get started, but we will be looking at it all the time, see what's working, see what we can improve.
Okay, Councillor Annaliti.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Emma. I'm slightly concerned about the inclusion of public participation. I've been fortunate enough now for over 20 years to represent a ward that have parish councils, and I know that the meetings are mostly public driven. If you want to encourage members of the public to attend the scrutiny committees, how do you intend to generate interest in them? How do you intend to advertise these meetings to them? You're not talking of a parish of hundreds of people, you're talking of thousands. How do you want to publicize these meetings? How do you want to police the kind of information that's being discussed at the meeting? Because at parish level is local interest. You know, you're talking of high platform information here. So, so the inclusion of public participation, I think it needs a bit of good thinking before you embark on that.
I'll invite you to respond to that, but I would just interject that Mark can respond with his officer hat on. I would suggest that both chairs, vice chairs, and also the various political groups probably have an interest in that encouragement and participation ourselves. So, you know, as a chair, I know I've got some control on what we are discussing at a meeting. So effectively, if I think that if I make having stuff discussed that I think the public would be interested in, I think that's kind of almost falls on me to make them interested in coming and letting them know. So I think, yeah, I'll pass over to you as the officers, but I just want to stress my personal opinion is it's not just up to the council officers. I think it's up to members a lot as well.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, meetings are open, obviously, for members of the public to come along if they want, and they can speak as well. But they have to give notice of their intention to come and speak, and we would intend to keep that so we can manage attendance. But this is more about getting members of the public who might have a particular interest in a deep dive topic that we're putting forward for members' consideration. So we will properly manage it. As I say, public can come along. It doesn't happen a lot, but we do publicise now, and members of the public can watch these meetings as they wish. So we're much more accessible. So we want to continue that, but we will manage it in accordance with current practices. So I don't see it being a huge problem that we can't manage.
Okay. Councillor Stevens.
Coming back to a remark I made at Spey, talking about deep dives in the reports that are likely to come through. The reports do have a gestation period, weeks ahead. It would be helpful to members to have sight of the reports, even in draft form, well ahead of a meeting, because seeing it in the last 10 days and you've got lots of pages to read is not terribly helpful.
Okay, I mean, we can look at that. If we've got a work plan with a more of an annual work plan, and those deep dive topics, there's a bit more time for preparation, we can see that it is possible to release. I mean, we stick to the current statutory 5-day because, you know, we're managing meetings across the board, so there's a lot of different reports coming through for the different committees. But if there is a real detailed report, we can perhaps look at whether it is possible to release it earlier.
Okay. Sorry, Councillor Weston.
Just going on from what Garrett was saying, you know, the reports that I find are fine, but it's up to the members to make sure they read them. Now, I find quite a few times when I go to meetings, the members don't read the reports. They come into a meeting, they just sit at their computers and the reports there and then. So it's up to the members to make sure they read reports before they go into a meeting, so they've got ideas of the questions and answers they are expecting to receive from either the officers or from other members. That's my only info.
I would agree with you on that one. I'd be very curious to know if Mark's got any suggestions on how we can force members to do that, other than the slightly embarrassment that and shame that I hope that councillors feel if they are sitting in a meeting completely unprepared.
Well, I think it's a good point, but the aim is to, even though it may be a deep dive report, that doesn't mean it has to be 20 pages long necessarily. It's about being more condensed with the information. so that it is easier to read, so members don't feel it's particularly onerous to sit there and read a really long report.
Any further questions? No, I've just got two quick ones of my own. Is there any consideration of changing the format and the makeup of meetings? So, for example, having more members on a scrutiny committee effectively means you can digest less of a report because sharing the work, and our scrutinies are all in person at the moment, where we have a few other possible meetings where there is hybrid side. So I haven't seen anything in proposals of changing any of that. Is that in scope? Has it already been considered?
So Ian might like to comment on this actually, but we did look at the numbers of committees at the moment, and it was felt it was appropriate, the current numbers for committees. Bearing in mind we have 3 committees across the board, and you have to be careful because otherwise you end up with not enough members to fill the committee seats across the board. So we looked at it and felt it was appropriate. In terms of hybrid meetings, there is a government consultation out at the moment regarding hybrid meetings. So I would suggest there is a fair chance that they'll be bringing in legislation which will enable councils to look at hybrid for different meetings. Depending on the rules, depending on if it comes in, the council will then have to look at what meetings we're going to apply that to across the board, but that'll be for a future discussion. Ian, did you have anything to say on member numbers at all?
No, as you say, we did look at it, and we felt, I think, that the potential overcapacity in scrutiny was probably the fact that it might meet too often, and meetings therefore were not particularly long, and the outputs of committees could be improved. So didn't necessarily think we needed more committees or less committees. The structure, we thought the architecture was about right, but perhaps the best way to sharpen it would be to focus on less through less meetings, less frequency.
Okay, I think that closes off the presentation. No more comments. Okay, so thank you very much. I will link that into my next point. Oh yes, thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much.
It's very informative on the presentation there.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to mention work programme. So obviously got highlighted on the point there about councillor control of work programme. I can't stress enough that right at the moment, the control of the work programme does sit with councillors, with the chair acting as, in theory, as a bridge between officers and committee members to know what people want to talk about and when it is practical to bring those forward. But I completely agree with the point that, especially for this committee, it is mostly officer-led, but that is not through opportunity. I actively encourage people to bring requests, but 90% of I think what we talk about is officers, myself and Trudy, discussing and thinking what is a good idea and trying to bring to deep dive. So alongside these presentations, I just want to remind people that you can come and ask for anything you want to come to scrutiny. I would not be doing my job if I didn't sort of have intelligent conversations and asking for things to be brought. Now, especially if we are looking at those work programmes being a year in advance, we do want them to be flexible and adaptable things to basically raise the concerns that we have as a community. So with that, I very much encourage anybody to come running to me or to Trudy to make any requests for changes to the work programme or things you'd like us to consider. I'm afraid that's not the last item because for all of my grandstanding, I have made a critical error on a chair, is that I missed our very first item, which is I need to approve the minutes of our last meeting, which was all the way back on 4th of December 2024, which was not the meeting in which we had a member of the public, but it was one straight after. So can I just check that nobody has any comments or concerns with the meeting minutes before I sign those? Okay, thank you very much. Have a great evening.